Ready? Good evening. If you have a mobile, if you would like to put it on silent, please, thank you. Right, massive welcome back to Mark Devlin with Occult Aspects of the Beatles and the McCartney Conspiracy. DJ, author and researcher Mark delves into the Beatles, their influence on the world, and their architects, if indeed they had any. Mark pays particular attention to Paul McCartney, who, some say, may have died in a car crash and was replaced, and others who say that he is who he says he is, and it was somebody else in the car. Anyway, let's go digging. Please welcome Mark Devlin.
Thanks a lot, Rob. Evening, everyone. This is, I think, my fourth or fifth time at New Horizons. I've lost count, actually. But this talk, as you can see, is titled Occult Aspects of the Beatles and the McCartney Conspiracy. And the thing about me as a researcher is that I'm very progressive, I'm very inclusive, I'm very liberal, you know, in keeping with the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. So I don't discriminate. I seek to piss off everyone and denigrate everyone's heroes. So tonight is the Beatles, you know, but if your favourite group is somebody else, I'll get around to them at some point. But seriously speaking, though, it actually brings me no pleasure to have to be questioning whether the Beatles were four regular working class lads from Liverpool who just happened to put a band together, play a few gigs, write some really good songs, get a record deal, and against all the odds become the most successful and influential pop group of all times. I would love it if that were the case, but unfortunately all the research that I've done and that many other authors and researchers and scholars into this area have done paints a rather different story. The Beatles are a group that you can spend weeks, months, years researching and trying to get to the bottom of. They're endlessly fascinating. One of the things that keeps so many researchers on the path is the fact that they're such an interesting group to delve into, and their music was great. I'm a fan of the music. I really don't feel that in 50 years' time you're going to have researchers at events like this looking back on the cultural legacy of One Direction or Drake. I can't see it happening. But with the Beatles, there's still no end of things to be uncovered all these decades later. And you don't get that with any other group, including the Rolling Stones. There's interesting occult aspects to delve into with the Rolling Stones, but nobody comes close to the Beatles when it comes to fascinating material. So let's get into it. Part 2, by the way, is going to be all about the Paul McCartney situation. Researchers into these areas refer to that whole subject as Paul is dead regularly, bringing the suggestion forward that the real Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced. I used to buy into that rather simplistic narrative myself, but I've done a whole bunch more research and spoken to a whole load of different people in the meantime to have changed my position on it slightly, and we'll be getting into that in part 2. But for part 1, let's look at the group themselves. And a good place to start would be with the original naming of the group. How did that name come about in the first place? So we find that John Lennon first called the group the Blackjacks before it morphed into the Quarrymen, and then it became Johnny and the Moondogs, the Nurk Twins for 2 days, the Beatles spelt with 2 A's, then it was the Silver Beatles, the Silver Beats, and the Silver Beatles spelt the way we know, before eventually surviving as the Beatles. And Lennon is classically on record as making this rather ambiguous comment regarding the name of the group, where he said, "It came in a vision. A man appeared on a flaming pie and said unto them, from this day forward, you are the Beatles with an A. Thank you, Mr. Man," they said, thanking him. That could be an aspect of masterful speaking in the Masonic tradition. It certainly leaves room for interpretation in terms of what he meant there. It's in very veiled terms. Interestingly, there was a book put out by the notorious British occultist Aleister Crowley, who does tend to pop up quite a lot in these stories when you look at the backstory of the rock music industry. He's always there making a cameo. And he put out this work called The Winged Beetle early in the 20th century. And you'll note from the title of the work there, we have the names of two groups which Paul McCartney was involved with, Wings and the Beatles, which could well be relevant. In Egyptian mythology, which we're going to visit a few times in this story, there was this creature known as a scarab beetle, which was a type of dung beetle. And its party trick was to roll up these balls of dung and use its hind legs to sort of roll them across the ground and gather them together. Now, these creatures came to be revered in Egyptian mythology and ancient Egyptian cultures because the people believed that these beetles symbolized the sun being rolled across the sky at the beginning and the end of each day. It was part of their solar worship system. And we find references to this in much ancient Egyptian art, such as in this inscription here of a scarab beetle holding up a depiction of the sun. Just before we move on, interestingly, when it comes to emblems and pictorial representations of things, we can look at the coat of arms for George Martin, which was drawn up for him kind of late in his life. This isn't a family crest that goes way back into his ancestry, but it was done sort of some decades into his career. And we see that it depicts three of these creatures, these scarab beetles, within this shield here, with all kinds of other heraldry and regalia going on. But isn't it interesting that there are three beetles depicted there and not four when we think of George Martin's career and different aspects of the Beatles? More on that as we move on, as I say. Looking at the childhood of John Lennon, who put together the group, it was his original vision, we find some interesting stuff. So he grew up raised by his Aunt Mimi in an area of Liverpool called Woolton, in a road called Menlove Avenue, which in itself is a name to conjure with, I'm sure you would agree. Just down the road from where the young Lennon grew up, we have the original Strawberry Field children's home, orphanage, and here are the gates to this very Gothic-looking building, which of course led to the famous song Strawberry Fields Forever, and it also inspired the Strawberry Fields monument in New York's Central Park, very close to the Dakota building where John Lennon was assassinated in December 1980. So that particular location had a very strong influence on what would come to be represented over there in New York. Looking at the area where Lennon grew up, and if we study a map of that region, you've got Menlove Avenue running down the centre there. And we can look at some of the other road names that we get, such as at the top there, Druidsville Road. And there's the Hollies as well, in terms of the holly tree, which came to be represented in the name of Hollywood, as in the Hollywood film industry. The Hollywood was something which Druids back in ancient times would fashion magic wands out of. So this speaks to Hollywood being all about magic spells and mind control and such. So we've got a road there called the Hollies, which is very tied into pagan druidic culture. A video is out there on YouTube, which was created by Thomas Sheridan, the Irish researcher who looked into these aspects of Lennon's childhood, and he identified these different road names in the area, such as Druids Cross Road and Druidsville Road. And a caption that comes from his video reads, "All of this must have directly impacted upon the young Lennon as he played in the ancient strawberry fields which had remained intact for centuries. The field would have retained the same mystical animism within its environment from pre-Christian times." So he's implying that the young, impressionable Lennon would have soaked up much of the energy and the consciousness that was present in that area due to the energetic imprint from what went on there in previous times, notably druidic activity. Excuse me 1 second, throat's getting dry already. So then he goes on, these childhood experiences would have been released from his subconscious as Lennon began to explore Hinduism and other spiritual paths during the writing and recording of Strawberry Fields Forever, getting into what led to some of these more esoteric and mystical and ambiguous lyrical themes that we saw in Beatles songs, particularly those written by Lennon. Now this is John Lennon's old man, his dad, Freddie Lennon, who was a sailor, and he spent much of the young John Lennon's childhood away at sea. But he was also an amateur musician himself. And we have here the sleeve to a single that he put out called That's My Life. It's misspelt on here as That's My Live, but it's supposed to be That's My Life. And I've got a little snippet of it to play you just next. But before we do that, isn't it interesting that we've got this Masonic checkerboard design on the sleeve? The duality that we see represented on the floor of Masonic temples, and which we see cropping up in popular culture time and time again in music videos and promotional photos and movies and things like this through the decades. Right now you can look at the current breed of pop music videos that are put out there by all the popular mainstream artists, and you see this duality checkerboard design pretty much every time. It seems to be a symbolic visual hint as to what it is these people are involved with, probably Freemasonry in this case. So there's no direct proof of any kind that Freddie Lennon was a Mason or was involved in, these secret societies, but we can speculate on that possibly being the case when it comes to how it was that the Beatles achieved their success and how it was that these were the personnel that made up that group over and above any other possible ones. So here's the original lineup of the Beatles, 5 members. We've got John, George Harrison, we've got a young Paul McCartney, or one of them, over there on bass. We've got Stuart Sutcliffe, who was the original bassist before McCartney took over that role. And in the centre we got Pete Best, the original drummer. Pete Best's mother, Mona Best, owned a venue in Liverpool called the Casbah Coffee Club, and it was here that the Beatles played some of their earliest gigs, pre-fame, in that city. There's all kinds of interesting stories regarding Pete Best and his family. There's a very close associate of the Beatles by the name of Neil Aspinall, who worked as a kind of roadie and a personal assistant to the group alongside another guy called Mel Evans, who we'll cover later. And Neil Aspinall moved in with Pete Best's family for a period in the early 60s, and during the time that he was living in Pete Best's house, he impregnated his mother, like you do. And the result was a son who came to be known as Rogue Best. So you got this very bizarre situation where you got Neil Aspinall, who's the same age as all these other guys and the same age as Pete, and he's got a son with Pete's mother. It's a pretty strange setup. Whether or not that had any bearing on Pete being removed from the group and replaced by Ringo, I really don't know. But in 1962, just prior to the Beatles breaking through to major fame, you had Pete being removed as the drummer and replaced by Ringo. And one of the stories we get is that Pete was quite a good-looking fella in his prime, and he was getting a lot of attention from the girls. And it was felt by Brian Epstein that this attention should be going to John and Paul, and they just wanted to deflect some of this attention that was coming from girls towards Pete. So they replaced him with Ringo. Problem solved, right? So here's Stuart Sutcliffe. Stuart died at the ripe old age of 21 in 1962. And he got some kind of brain aneurysm or hemorrhage. The story that we get there is that he got involved in a fight in Hamburg during the days that the Beatles were playing these all-night gigs in these pretty rough spots in that particular city. And during this fight, he got kicked in the head during the skirmish, and this led to him developing a sort of brain aneurysm, which eventually finished him off. So there's the first of many very mysterious and sort of suspicious deaths in the Beatles' backstory.